We have Brandon Huffman, 247 and CBS Sports, national recruiting, and he joins us on 365 Sports. Brandon, thank you very much. How has the transfer portal changed how you guys cover both high school and or the transfer portal recruiting?
Yeah, I mean, it's made it much more seasonal in the sense that recruiting is essentially done for the 2026 class, and we still have 4 months until signing day. We've got the season to be played, but it really seems like, the 4th of July is kind of that sweet spot when guys like to be committed, when coaches like to have their their classes already done. And then they start monitoring, who do we have to keep on our own roster this fall? Who's going to get poached from our roster? And then come December, everybody's signed. Now we got 3 weeks to keep our roster together. So it really has kind of limited the recruiting, which had been a year-round thing, to about an 8-month window. And then you're covering the portal, who's coming, who's going, who could leave, for another 3 or 4 months out of that.
Brandon, how do you have to change the metrics of the way do you look at classes of just high school, just transfers, or do you personally like to combine it and try to get numbers out of that to know who's really doing the best in the aggregate?
Yeah, I mean, 24/7 Sports has the ability to do it all, where we have a transfer-specific ranking, we have a recruiting-specific ranking, and then we have the overall ranking. What school maybe only signed 6 guys but then really cleaned house in the transfer portal? I think, Colorado has been one of those schools that has really utilized the portal the last couple classes to kind of offset the inability to really put together big classes or even playing the long game in recruiting. So we do kind of provide all 3 variables in an evaluation to see what everybody coming into a roster in the fall, albeit, whether they be incoming freshmen or whether they be seniors with their 6th year of eligibility left to play. But I would like to say we really focus on the recruiting part of it, because those are guys we have been watching since they were freshmen in high school. So you follow the recruiting process a little bit closely. The portal seems to be a lot of those guys that maybe we knew early on who didn't really do much at the schools that they were at. And then you have the guys that were the sleepers that weren't necessarily on our radar and now find themselves 3 years into college on the radar.
So I was looking through the top team rankings, and I think the top's pretty much what you expect. Usually the same handful, 10 teams or so. But looking at the first Big 12 team, you do have to go down a ways, and it is all the way to, I believe, BYU at number 20. I saw an article the other day talking about BYU's surge in recruiting. I mean, in the NIL era, but also the Big 12 backing. Are they what some people have termed a sleeping giant in your eyes when it comes to recruiting, and how much has the last couple of years of the changes in conference and also what you're able to do recruiting wise aided the Cougars and Kalani Sitake?
I think there's a couple things. First of all, they didn't give up on Kalani Sitake. When there had been some up and down seasons, they played the long game and they stuck with stability. And if you look back at BYU historically, go back to Lavelle Edwards and his longevity there. The Gary Crutton years weren't so great, but Bronco Mendenhall was kind of there for a while before he left for Virginia. But he didn't have the resources that Kalani has gotten the last couple of years. Kalani is a BYU guy. They had those years in the wilderness when they were an independent and then had their lumps that first year in the Big 12. But getting into the Big 12 certainly helped them. They're also a national brand. They're one of those schools that has, if you see a BYU game on the road, there's a good chunk of BYU fans in the stadium, no matter what part of the country that they're playing. They're not just a Utah team. And I think everybody thought that Utah was going to come into the Big 12 and really take it by storm. But BYU had been building and kind of smoldering to this. And then we've seen what the resources that they're being provided on the basketball side of things. And that's carrying over to football and why they have such a good class. So I think there's 4 or 5 different reasons why BYU has been able to make that transition and to be able to be a top 20 recruiting class right now. And it also doesn't hurt that a number of the key targets that they've had that are highly ranked nationally are of the LDS state.
All right, so of the 4 schools that were the first flood or the first movement after Texas, Oklahoma decided they were going to leave, BYU seems to be well ahead of West Virginia, UCF, and Cincinnati. When it comes to who's doing what recruiting-wise, how much of a gap is there with those schools?
Well, I think there's a significant gap in the sense that, West Virginia is still such a geographical outlier into the Big 12. And then there's not like a real fertile recruiting base in the state of West Virginia. You got, if there are, Pennsylvania schools are going to come in there. You have the other ACC and the SEC schools that'll go up there. I think UCF has probably the most fertile recruiting base outside of the Texas schools in the Big 12. But again, those guys that are going to UCF, in most cases, it's because they didn't get recruited by Florida State, or by Miami. And so, they're not necessarily getting that top tier guys. And maybe Gus Malzahn was kind of, like a lot of people that moved to Orlando in their career, kind of stick it into retirement mode. And maybe Scott Frost will infuse it. Whereas Cincinnati is another school that all the momentum they seem to have with Luke Fickell has kind of gone by the wayside. And so I think that BYU has got a pretty significant gap on all three of those schools. And I don't necessarily see it shrinking despite Ohio having a lot of good players, the state of Florida having a lot of good players, and maybe more, if not Ohio having more than the state of Utah. But I think BYU is so much more ingrained, and it was a natural transition for them to go to the Big 12, whereas UCF, West Virginia still for all these years, and Cincinnati are a little bit of kind of geographic anomalies.
Well, I said West Virginia. Craig looked at me like you're right by showing me. I meant Houston. West Virginia was the first little, and they have Henderson. And Willie Fitz, of course, has had a great run wherever he's been. How are the Cougars doing? And if they hold on and keep Henderson, obviously that would be a major deal for them.
Yeah, I mean, Houston is the one school where there's not a big gap between those two Cougars, between BYU and Houston. And I think you look at what Houston has done on the basketball side of things, that is what Houston football envisions themselves doing in the Big 12 and eventually being not just a Big 12 competitor, but a national competitor. And I think there was that time when Tom Herman was there a decade ago and they got Ed Oliver out of the city of Houston to stay and go to Houston. And now Keyshawn Henderson to not only get his commitment, but be able to hold on to his commitment. I think that's a gigantic step in showing that Houston expects to be taken seriously and is going to be a real contender for top recruits, not just in the city of Houston, but in the state of Texas. So I think, BYU might have the higher rated class right now, but Houston is in a much better position long-term as opposed to BYU, just given the recruiting base that they're recruiting from.
Nationally, looking at your 2026 rankings, USC is second, and that is not somewhere. Obviously, they had a good year last year too, or this year, 2025. Do you expect to see Lincoln Riley be the Lincoln Riley he was at Oklahoma now? Does he have what he needs? Is the talent there, not only there and in the portal, that they can look like they're paying him to look?
Well, I mean, he's always had those resources. It seemed to me that was a great kind of soundbite to have when he got to USC and feigning poverty, like when he was at Oklahoma, and then getting to USC and feigning poverty at USC. What it really came down to was the fact that he thought that USC was a national brand, and they are. But he wanted to recruit Texas. He wanted to recruit the South. He wanted to recruit all those states and would get those guys early commitments. And then those guys would end up staying in their Southwest region or the SEC region. And the West Coast kids had already committed to an Oregon by that point. They'd already committed to Washington. They'd committed to all the other schools. And that's where USC shot themselves in the foot. So they bring in Chad Bowden this offseason. He says, we are going to focus on Southern California. We are going to focus on the West Coast. Now there's no more excuses. The one thing Lincoln Riley does have going for him is a ridiculously large buyout. And USC, you don't leave USC on your own unless your name's Pete Carroll. You get told that you're going to leave USC by the athletic department and by the boosters, which means they're paying a lot of buyout clauses. So his buyout is so significant that they're basically saying, we're not giving you anything else that we haven't already, promised you. We're giving you the highest paid general manager in sports now, or in college football. Now go make something of it. And I think that, the time for excuses is out. And if anything, he became a victim of his own success with how he transitioned from Bob Stoops at Oklahoma and his first year at USC. But is Lincoln Riley in 2023 and 2024 the rule rather than the exception of what he was from 2017 to 2022?
Brandon, who are a couple of programs maybe that you found interesting to follow here of late? I mean, obviously Texas Tech's getting a lot of attention that they weren't otherwise getting. I've seen you retweet Sacramento State a couple times. They got the number one class right in, was it 27 right now?
Yeah.
But what are maybe just a couple of teams or storylines that you found of interest that is a little bit different from the norm?
Yeah, Texas Tech, obviously, I think that goes without saying. Interestingly enough, before it really seemed like Cody Campbell was giving them all the resources, or at least to the extent where it became such a story, there was a time last summer where Texas Tech had the top class in the 2025 rankings and in the 2024 because they did a really good job early on. So them being kind of at the top, and being a school that has been having good recruiting classes, it's not a complete outlier, maybe winning some of the battles. To me, I think one of them is SMU. And this is the program that, 4 or 5 years ago didn't seem like they were heading in the right direction. And then Rhett Lashlee comes in and, they had those good years under June Jones after he got there from Hawaii. But you're seeing SMU make that transition to the ACC, make the playoffs, and now have a top 25 class. And, again, I'm almost 50 years old. I do remember a time. My brother's roommate in college, his dad was an offensive lineman on the Pony Express back in the late 70s. I remember a time when SMU was relevant in football, and then there was all those years in the wilderness themselves. But, to see them recruit at a top 20, 25 level, given all the other schools they're going up against in the state of Texas, is kind of just, I wouldn't say it's jarring, but they're one of those old Sesame Street, like one of these is not like the other. And I also think that if anybody had been watching UCLA football under Chip Kelly and his absolute allergy to recruiting, period, let alone recruiting high schoolers, to see them in the top 25 with Deshaun Foster at the helm has been kind of what UCLA fans had hoped that somebody could do going back to the Jim Moore years. So two schools that have had a proud history and a proud tradition, but then have had some pretty tough years recruiting-wise, and a lot of it being self-inflicted, now with top 25 classes, but both in major markets.
Brandon, I've seen this over the summer, but I've seen this before with recruiting. This is not any way to check you or question you or any of the sites, but how much does the program name, when they get a commitment, affect or change when they are committed to what would you call a non-blue blood program, and then
Sure.
they decommit? How much? You're right there in the middle of all that war room. Tell me what's said.
I think you're always going to acknowledge that there is going to be maybe a PR type of spin to it. We saw it when another website dropped Ryder Lyons, who had been a 5-star, and he dropped pretty low. And then another quarterback moved up ahead of him who had been ranked a 3-star a month before and hadn't played a game in 6 months. So, yeah, you could say that they're that, but Keyshawn Henderson hasn't seen his ranking drop. Ed Oliver remained a 5-star. I mean, I think that the thing is, people want to nitpick that and say that, hey, if he would have been committed to this school, he would have been a highly rated player. Well, remind me of all this great success that Texas A&M has had on the field, and yet they were signing these big name classes and they haven't done anything on the field to back it. So I think it works both ways. We can fine comb tooth that there's a lot of schools that, yeah, their players all seem to be ranked, but then there are 3-stars that are significant parts of the Alabama team, of the Ohio State teams, of the Michigan teams, the Georgia teams, the last 2 national champions. There have been guys that weren't ranked high, and there's, I think, this feeling that, if he goes there, I think the famous phrase is the Bama bump. Well, there's a lot of guys that on that Bama roster that weren't ranked high. I just think that some become so glaring, but I think in this day and age now, you're seeing elite players go to the schools that aren't the traditional blue bloods because of opportunities, whether it be in NIL, whether it be in potentially putting themselves in the NFL. I think, the game is evening out, and that's how you end up with an Indiana and an SMU and an Arizona State in the 12-team playoff in year one.
Brandon, I was talking to a high school buddy of mine who's a coach, high school coach down in Florida now. We were in Florida when we were there, but in high school. But he's a coach, and he said that there are a lot of weird, like the how much they can have contact, which is even less than it is here in Texas. The way that they allow them to have summer weights, the way that they kind of legislate everything. The FHSAA has put really restrictive rules on coaching and development and all these things. And he thinks he's seen the level of talent drop a little bit than it was, say, 20 years ago in Florida. Have you seen that?
I have, in the sense that there's still some elite players, but a lot of those times those elite players end up at IMG from other states. Mm-hmm. I think what you're seeing is Georgia is getting a lot of those players that would have traditionally gone down to Florida. We've seen the Big Three become the Big Four. And, I say this as a born and bred Southern Californian and native and high school football player in Southern California. You could convince me that California has dropped to fourth, despite with the numbers having still more players in the state of Georgia is signing and getting onto college. Just because of the population, California has dipped to fourth. And I think Florida is trending in that direction as well, where you're seeing a lot of super holdbacks. And then you're seeing those guys get to college, and the main thing wasn't the main thing anymore. And now schools are saying, hey, is it worth taking on the headaches and all the other stuff that comes with it? We can go get a dog out of Georgia or Texas, or go into Louisiana, or go into Nevada and Utah, and to some of the regions maybe we didn't go before. And then I also see that with some states where it's becoming more difficult to afford living, like California, you're seeing an increase in talent in Arizona and Nevada and Utah because people are leaving California. And I think Florida is suffering from that same thing, where there's going to be a lot of talent. You want to, plant a flag in the state of Florida, but Miami, Florida, and Florida State are no longer relying on just kids from in the state. And I think that now kids are saying, well, I don't have to be here. It's not necessarily giving me an advantage over other states. And here comes Georgia, seeing their talent level rise, their numbers rise. And I think Georgia has been kind of Florida's problem.
Yeah, no question. There was a time when Florida schools weren't very good because everybody was raiding the state. And all of a sudden they put walls around it. And that's when all three of them had a jump. Not New Orleans, but Louisiana, without question, big bang for your buck as far as pound for pound. Arizona's on the rise, you mentioned. Who else would you say, pound for pound, like a Louisiana, is sneaky deep with talent?
Yeah, I think Mississippi has always been one of those states where I think the numbers have shown something like, per capita, Mississippi has like the highest level of talent outside of Louisiana in terms of the amount of high school football players who then end up signing. Louisiana is obviously one of those unique states in which there's only one Power 4 school in the state. And then you've got Tulane, you've got Louisiana Monroe, Louisiana Lafayette, but LSU just dominates. They have no peer when it comes to their state. And so I think that's why, LSU has been so dominant, about why you're also seeing schools try to make Louisiana a stomping ground for them, where they want to set their flagpoles up. So I think Mississippi is kind of right there, where, you got Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and then you got Southern Miss. But Ole Miss is able to recruit on a national level. Mississippi State's always been about evaluating their own in-state talent really well. So I think that, those two states, and then, again, I know we talked a little bit about Utah earlier, but Utah is a state that I'm seeing a real increase. It's funny because when COVID hit, one of the reasons that Jackson Dart became one of the most recruited quarterbacks in the country, and it's probably part of the reason why Zach Wilson went number 2 in the draft, is if you remember, BYU was the only one that was playing football out west because they were an independent early in the season. Well, Utah started playing high school football in August that season, while California, Oregon, and Washington didn't play until the spring. Nevada canceled the majority of their season. Hawaii didn't play. And families were leaving Hawaii to go to Utah. Families were leaving Nevada to go to Utah so that their kids can play. And now we're starting to see, we debuted our top 100 players for 2028, and Utah has 3 players in the top 100, which I think is the most they've had in the debut rankings in a number of years. And so you're seeing Utah, which people thought when you get to Utah, it was just for the big boys. It was for the offensive lineman and defensive lineman. We're seeing quarterbacks. We're seeing running backs. We're seeing receivers. We're seeing linebackers. We're seeing DBs that are high school football players in the state of Utah that are going on and flourishing in college football and then beyond. And so Utah's kind of that other state, which I think the Big 12 schools like. Hey, we saw Opawika went to Baylor after transferring from LSU and became a force in the middle for Dave Aranda's defense. And I think, this year, Kai Wesley out of Utah as well, from Timpview High School, right there at Orem High School, right there in the backyard of BYU and Utah, headed to Baylor. So you're seeing more and more schools saying, hey, we can go recruit Utah. Those kids want to leave the state too. It's not just for BYU and Utah.
What I find interesting in all the years I've covered it, which is for a long, long time, and Brandon, great stuff. We hope to have you on again, is that you have a school that's in a state that's a really good school. They're going to get whoever not they want, because not everybody gets that. But they say, we don't want you leaving our state, and yet they have to go outside the state themselves to get better players. It's kind of not hypocritical, but it is a little bit interesting.
I live in Seattle for another 2 weeks, and I'm moving to Arizona, which is why there's probably a little bit of an echo. My walls are bare, but it's been fascinating. It's been fascinating with the University of Washington, where this state has, the fan base has always been. I mean, UCLA and USC were losing players from Southern California since the beginning of time. Cal and Stanford had been losing players from the Bay Area from the beginning of time. Arizona and Arizona State, the big knock on coaches for the last 20, 30 years is their inability to keep the local players. But Washington made it to the national championship game 2 years ago with a lot of players that weren't from their backyard. And so, it's been funny that most states and most schools have realized this game is no longer regional. All right. It's not about playing right in front of mom and dad. Now you got schools that part of your NIL deal is making sure that mom and dad have 4 tickets and hotels to every game, home and away. So it's now just as easy to get on an airplane and fly to your game across the country than it is to drive to your game in your backyard. Every game's televised. Every game is streamed. So you're now seeing more and more schools saying, hey, if the game isn't regional, if the game is national, let's let our recruiting be national. Let's not just recruit our backyard. The problem is, and I talked about it with Lincoln Riley earlier, if you don't keep the local kids warm and you go chase the national guys, when you strike out on them, you can't just come back to those local kids and say, hey, no, we really wanted you all along. They knew that you didn't want them in the first place, and those national schools recruiting you. So I think fan bases are now starting to realize, yeah, we'd love to have the local kid who dreamed of playing for us, but we also want that really good kid that we may not have recruited 10 years ago when the game was more regional. We now have a chance to go across the country and get a player that we wouldn't have even thought of recruiting. We wouldn't even send a letter to a decade ago to now say, hey, half of our roster comes from outside these state walls. And I think as the game continues to become a national game, and you see these very janky geographic conferences anymore, it's even becoming more so that you can't just recruit local, you have to recruit nationally,
Brandon,
and you need to stop worrying about the walls.
Hey, man, thank you very much. Brandon Huffman, 247 CBS Sports. Garrett Ross, by the way, does work with 247 Sports and coverage of Baylor. Thank you very much for your time. Great to have you on.